People are going to kill me, Haitians fear deportation from U.S. The consensus read is already outdated. What matters now is the second-order effect most commentary still ignores. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Haitians facing removal now confront a lethal calculus: stay and risk gang violence, or return to a country where humanitarian groups estimate over 5,000 have died this year from gang-related violence alone. But here's what most people miss: this deportation surge is forcing AI systems and biometric databases across U.S. immigration to process cases at speeds they've never handled before. And that's creating cascading failures with real consequences. Let's start with the raw signal. According to reporting from the Financial Times and migration advocacy groups, Haitian nationals are being processed for removal at rates 34% higher than they were 6 months ago. The numbers alone tell you something has shifted in policy enforcement. But the second-order effect is where this story connects to AI and systems thinking. Here's the infrastructure problem: U.S. Customs and Border Protection, ICE, and the Department of Homeland Security rely on interconnected databases, facial recognition systems, biometric matching, case history AI models, and predictive risk assessment tools, to process deportation cases. These systems were designed for baseline throughput. When volume spikes 34% over baseline, you don't just get a 34% slowdown. You get cascade failures. Identity verification takes longer. Biometric matches start timing out. Risk assessment models trained on historical data suddenly face cases outside their training distribution. What does that mean in practice? Immigration officers in field offices report delays of 2 to 4 weeks in case processing where the standard was 5 to 7 days. Courts are backing up. Detention facilities are overcrowded. And most critically, when AI systems are under load, they make more errors. False positives in identity verification spike. Algorithmic recommendations for case priority become less reliable. The system starts making decisions at speed rather than accuracy, and that's when vulnerable people fall through the cracks. Now, zoom out to the policy layer. The acceleration in Haitian deportations is a direct signal of enforcement priority. DHS has deprioritized prosecutorial discretion, the legal mechanism that allows officials to defer cases for humanitarian reasons. That means fewer cases get manually reviewed before AI systems make the initial recommendation. More cases flow through the algorithmic pipeline untouched by human judgment. And algorithmic systems, by design, can't account for the individual threat someone faces if they're returned. Here's the human consequence: Haitian nationals being processed have documented that they face specific, verifiable threats in Haiti. Some are former law enforcement, some are journalists, some are witnesses to crimes. These facts require contextual judgment. But when the system is running at 134% capacity, those contextual reviews get compressed into checkbox procedures. An AI system can verify that someone is Haitian and has a prior deportation. It cannot reliably assess whether returning them to Port-au-Prince puts them in mortal danger. The secondary impact ripples across the entire immigration apparatus. Other deportation cases, from Central America, from Mexico, from West Africa, are now competing for processing capacity. The AI systems managing case priority are making trade-offs they weren't designed for. Asylum cases that should get expedited review are getting bottlenecked. And the more cases back up, the longer vulnerable people spend in detention, which has its own documented health and safety consequences. So what changes next? 3 signals to watch. First, technical. DHS will need to either expand biometric processing capacity or redesign the AI models that manage case flow. That takes 60 to 90 days minimum, and requires budget justification. Second, legal. Humanitarian organizations are filing injunctions and appeals. If courts mandate individual case review before deportation, the entire acceleration strategy collapses, and the system has to retool for slower, more manual processes. Third, political. if the deportation surge continues and media documents cases where deported Haitians face imminent threats, the public pressure could force a policy reversal, which would signal a change in enforcement priorities and reduce pressure on the system. What matters for you? If you work in immigration, tech policy, or human rights, this is a live case study in what happens when policy acceleration outpaces system capacity. If you follow AI governance, this is a textbook example of how algorithmic systems fail when volume, speed, and humanitarian stakes intersect. If you're invested in understanding how U.S. immigration enforcement actually works, this deportation surge shows you where the AI leverage points are and what happens when they're pushed past design limits. The broader pattern here is instructive. When governments accelerate enforcement using algorithmic systems, they're implicitly choosing speed over accuracy. Haitians facing deportation are the immediate impact. But the systemic lesson, that overloaded AI systems make worse decisions, applies to every border, every asylum system, and every algorithmic enforcement apparatus globally. This is what it looks like when policy and technology move at different speeds. Keep watching the case processing timelines and the court filings. They'll tell you whether the system adapts or breaks. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.